John Bodkin Adams was born on the 20th of January 1899 in Randalstown, County Antrim, Ireland, a small close-knit town with quaint shops and cobblestone roads. He was the elder of two sons of Samuel Adams, a watchmaker, and Ellen Bodkin Adams. His childhood was spent mostly in Ballinderry, County Antrim, a picturesque village surrounded by fields and trees. The family belonged to the Plymouth Brethren, a group known for strict religious discipline and a popular way of life in Ireland at the time. Their main beliefs were that the Bible is the only authority for faith and life. They did not believe in church hierarchy and rejected the need for a separate ordained clergy or church, believing that all Christians have direct access to God and are spiritually equal. Samuel Adams led the family in prayers every morning and night and held a Bible class every Sunday. Ellen Bodkin also had a strong sense of faith and piousness. Both the Adams parents were keen cyclists, with Samuel proudly whizzing down the country roads on one of the first penny farthings to be owned in Ireland, begosh and begorra. By all accounts, they were a well-respected and reasonably likeable family. Samuel enjoyed the thrill of faster daring experiences, and when new forms of transport appeared, he eagerly tried them out, starting with the bike, then the motorbike, and later an open-top car. The family also invested in property and owned a shop that sold jewellery and watches. They were prosperous and moved to a better, bigger home in Ballinderry Bridge in County Tyrone. In 1903, another child was born to Samuel and Ellen. They named William, who enjoyed to run free and play, while John was more prone to staying close to his mother's side. John was named after his mother's brother, who was a skilled doctor and missionary. When John was 12, the family moved to Coleraine so he could attend Coleraine Academical Institution. The plan was for him to eventually study medicine, a respected Christian profession focused on helping others. Just before John was due to start at the Queen's University in Belfast Medical School, his father suffered a stroke and died at the age of 57. Ellen moved the family to Belfast to be closer to John. With her was William and her niece Sarah Helen, who she had taken in when her mother had passed away. It was now up to John as the eldest to look out for his family. He worked hard at Queen's but struggled academically. Not only did he struggle with the work, he struggled to fit in. It became obvious to his tutors he was painfully socially awkward, but he soldiered on because his belief in his faith and his family kept him focused. In 1918, 15-year-old William Bodkin Adams died of influenza, devastating the whole family, and John took on the responsibility of looking after his mother and cousin. With this in mind, he worked hard but was struggling. He eventually collapsed and was on the brink of a nervous breakdown. At this stage, his tutors recommended he should give up medicine. At home, he was nursed back to health by his mother and cousin. And encouraged by his mother, instead of giving up, John decided to try harder at Queen's. He eventually qualified without honours in 1921. It was important to Bodkin Adams that people noticed his achievements and respected him for them. If they didn't, he made sure to show his irritation. Helped by a member of the Plymouth Brethren, Adams was offered a junior position at Bristol Royal Infirmary. He worked hard as a house assistant, but it became clear he just wasn't happy in Bristol. He wasn't getting the praise he seemed to need to spur him on, as his mother and his cousin hadn't been able to move with him. Then in 1922, he saw an advertisement in a Christian newspaper that a small group of Christian GPs in Eastborne were looking for someone to join the practice with the possibility of a partnership. After an interview in the winter of 1922, he was accepted to join the small Christian general practice and moved there, accompanied by his mother and cousin, Sarah Henry. It was here he reinvented himself as a family doctor, knowing he could do what he wanted, well, to a degree, and he had his family with him. The young Bodkin brought a motorbike and spent long hours riding through the town, going from house call to house call. And with each visit he noticed the wealth of the elite who lived there, with their sparkling Rolls Royces and large houses. Because of Adams's feeling of self-importance, he went about his business by trying to be a part of the in crowd, the ones who could maybe further his career, and to do this he needed to establish himself. 61-year-old William Marhood lived in a place called Ratton with his wife Edith, 29-room mansion on some impressive grounds. It was a home consisting of maids, gardeners, chauffeurs and cooks, etc. And the family doctor, Bodkin Adams, was expected to visit the home if someone fell ill. Sometime between 1923 and 24, Edith Marhood broke her leg but refused to go into hospital, so the local doctor was sent for and Bodkin Adams responded to the call. He treated her leg and she apparently underwent 3 operations on it, but it failed to heal properly. Other than the leg problem, both Edith and her husband had no other health issues. Edith would later tell how Adams had ingratiated himself into their lives, turning up regularly for no reason and at the most inconvenient times, and often with his mother and cousin in tow. She went on to tell how he had invited himself on holiday with her and often brought things on her husband's account without paying her husband back. Something you could definitely say about Dr. Adams is he definitely enjoyed the finer things in life. One thing he shared with his father was the love of cars. He was especially fond of cars that drew attention. Mingling with the gentry was definitely going to his head, and by 1928 the delusional Dr. Adams had hired his own chauffeur to drive him from one house call to another. According to the chauffeur, he drove his mother and cousin all over, and he took up shooting. He attended shooting parties after gaining the trust of other local gentry members who also took part. By 1930, Dr. Adams decided he needed a bigger, more impressive house. They moved into Kent Lodge, a large Victorian villa in the town centre. Part of the lower floor was set aside for his surgery. The villa cost £3,000, which they borrowed from the Marhoods. Edith Marhood later said that he did repay this loan. The residents of Eastborne had their own feelings towards Dr. Adams. Many found him disagreeable and not a very good doctor at all, often finding his treatments and diagnosis unacceptable. It was said that whenever he heard that a patient wasn't happy with the treatment he had given, he became irritable. At one point, he tried to get power of attorney for a woman in her 70s who had been hit in the eye by a tennis ball. Adams claimed that because of the injury, she would no longer be able to see well enough to sign her cheques, so she should give him power of attorney. She didn't like this at all and told her friend, and together they went to the bank and gave the power of attorney to her friend and the bank manager before Adams could take any action. When he found out, he was not happy. And then there were those that thought he was the best. But after reading into the reasons why, it was mostly about friendship, not treatments, and possibly, allegedly, addictions. Mrs. Whitten, an elderly well-to-do widow, made 3 wills, one in 1929, one in 1932, but the one in 1933 was made by Dr. Adams, who had become very close to the elderly woman. He claimed the widow had instructed that a legacy of £500 to be left to Sarah Henry and £100 to Mansfield Hospital. Dr. Adams was the executor of the will. Around this time, the hotel staff where Mrs. Whitten lived grew worried about her declining health. Whenever the doctor was with her, she appeared lethargic and stayed in bed. However, when the doctor was on holiday, she became much better and more active. It was also the case when she went away. She was in good form on her return, but soon went downhill. The night Mrs. Whitten passed away, the doctor was called, as the staff noticed she seemed very ill. When he turned up, the manager declared that he thought it best that someone should inform Mrs. Whitten's relatives. But Adams said she had no relatives. She did in fact have stepchildren. A registered nurse had been called and went straight to the room, joining the doctor. She noted the patient was restless and thought she might be headed for a stroke. She took her leave for a few moments to another room to change, and on her return the doctor was waiting for her outside the bedroom door. He told her he'd given the patient an injection and she was sleeping. He asked the nurse not to go in the room as the patient didn't like the light on. The nurse sat outside her room. The doctor stayed for an hour and left around 11 p.m. At midnight the nurse checked on her patient. Then a few hours later she noticed Mrs. Whitten's breathing had changed. She was breathing heavily and looked unconscious. She called the doctor who, when he arrived, gave his patient an injection while the nurse was in the room. But she didn't know what was in the hypodermic needle. The doctor then left. The patient got gradually worse and her pulse became weaker. She remained unconscious, and after a few hours her pulse suddenly dropped and her breathing became shallow. The nurse called for Dr. Adams, but before he arrived, Mrs. Whitten was dead. The cause of death? Well, Dr. Adams wrote the cause of death being myocardial degeneration, high blood pressure and renal insufficiency. Those three terms describe chronic conditions, not a single clear-cut cause of death. Later on it would be said a chambermaid who had been worried about Mrs. Whitten's health said she saw the doctor slip a bottle of pills into his pocket. Another chambermaid said the doctor gave her a £1 note to keep quiet about her death. The nurse would go on to say she had seen Dr. Adams remove Mrs. Whitten's watch and take it away. She also saw him take a small attaché case. Mrs. Whitten's estate was fairly large, even after all the legacies were paid. These legacies were not very big. Some went to the hospitals, some to a church, and some to individuals, including Adams's cousin, Sarah Henry, who received the £500. £2,000 was left to her doctor, and the rest of the estate, strangely enough, also went to Dr. John Bodkin Adams, and it was the largest amount. Although the stepchildren fought the will, it was upheld, and her stepchildren received nothing. The codicil for Sarah Henry was not upheld, and Sarah Henry received nothing, but still benefited through Bodkin Adams. Mrs. Whitten's car and a lot of her personal things were taken to Kent Lodge, where the car was sold. It's known that there was jewellery amongst those items. Word had spread quickly and gossip was everywhere in the town of Eastborne. Was the good doctor to be trusted, or was he knocking off those poor elderly widows one by one? Hotel staff whispered about it, and the news carried on the sea breeze, reaching many ears. Soon people started to take notice of the strange, flamboyant Dr. Adams. It became apparent that throughout the 1940s Adams had a reputation for prescribing powerful opiates like morphine and heroin, serving mostly wealthy elderly widows. It would be discovered later, when they passed away, they had unexpectedly amended their wills to benefit him in some way. The doctor had already been warned, anonymously, that he should keep his fingers crossed and not bump off any more wealthy widows. Oddly, he didn't really seem to notice that there was gossip surrounding him. It really didn't bother him, as long as his lifestyle continued, and continue it did. In fact, it grew. His reputation in Eastborne became quite legendary in more ways than one. He mingled with the rich, behaved like a man of means, and to be fair, his bank account had grown somewhat. Why? Well, because he was a doctor, and as many now know, took great interest in the financial affairs of his elderly widow patients. But there were some that kept watching and noted how much the doctor liked to sedate his sickly ladies. Allegedly. He now owned a Rolls-Royce and delighted in his chauffeur driving him from call to call. Dr. Bodkin Adams flirted with the gentry, brought copious amounts of guns and attended shooting parties. His most profitable form of parasitism, leeching and manipulation involved a key figure in his future, possibly his new close friend Sir Rowland Gwynn, a decorated soldier and former mayor of Eastborne. The two unmarried men seemed to have a relationship characterised by trust, shared leisure and deep personal ties, possibly even romantic in nature, allegedly. Their bond seemed to be more than casual friendship, allegedly. It encompassed mutual affection and frequent social connection. It's reported that he visited the doctor's home every morning. They met at an event at Fowington Manor, a social event Gwynn was well known for. It's believed he was homosexual based on reports, but in that era this was against the law and generally kept secret. However, being a member of the gentry, he held power and influential connections, which may have given him some protection and freedom to be more open about his true nature. Dr. Adams was seen occasionally out with different ladies. He then met Nora O'Hara, the daughter of Eastbourne's wealthiest butcher. The O'Hara family were delighted and brought her home for the couple when they got engaged. But for some unknown reasons, their engagement was called off. Gertrude Joyce Bobby Hullet was a well-off widow living at Holywell Mount, a substantial house in the Meads Holywell area of Eastbourne. Her husband Jack Hullet died in March 1956. In the months after his death, Mrs. Hullet became low and anxious. Adams was her GP and someone she had socialised with. He had prescribed sodium barbitone and sodium phenobarbital for her nerves and to try and help her sleep, on and off, for quite some time. Dr. Adams went on to describe the amount of dosage he gave her over a period of 80 days, and this amount was considered large. At the coroner's inquest, however, after Adams explained how the dosage was given, and he claimed to have reduced the amount over time, it was confirmed by experts as normal. Friends and staff later told police she seemed increasingly drugged, while letters found later after her death showed she had possibly contemplated taking her own life that spring. On the 19th of July, Mrs. Hullet is thought to have taken an overdose and she collapsed into a coma. Adams was unavailable and a colleague, Dr. Harris, attended her until Adams arrived later that day. Despite her history of considering taking her own life, Harris diagnosed cerebral hemorrhage as the likely cause, as he had been told she had complained of a headache and giddiness the evening before. Dr. Harris was also told that Mrs. Hullet had been prescribed sleeping pills. He searched for an empty bottle, but he couldn't find one. Dr. Harris did ask about a possible barbiturate overdose, but Adams claimed it was impossible. Dr. Harris would later state he knew nothing about Mrs. Hullet's depression. The two doctors decided a cerebral hemorrhage was most likely, due partly to the contracted pupils. This, however, could also be a symptom of morphine or barbiturate poisoning. Dr. Shearer was called in to take a spinal fluid sample and immediately asked if her stomach contents should be examined in case of narcotics poisoning, but Adams and Harris both opposed this. A day or two later, Adams asked a colleague about the treatment for barbiturate poisoning. He was told to use 10 cc of megamide every 5 minutes as a drug to counteract the effects of a barbiturate overdose, and to use an intravenous drip. Adams administered one single 10 cc of megamide and did not apply a drip. Mrs. Hullet developed bronchopneumonia and died at 7:23 a.m. on the 23rd of July 1956. Adams certified a cerebral hemorrhage on the death certificate. However, toxicology from a urine sample taken on the 21st received after her death suggested a very large amount of sodium barbitone, well into the fatal range. At one point, Adams had even phoned the coroner to see if he would perform a private post-mortem 2 days before she had actually died. That obviously drew professional criticism and suspicion. Before the inquest, suspicions were raised. Coroner Angus Somerville called the Chief Constable of Eastborne, Richard Walker, and told him a second post-mortem by a Home Office pathologist would be needed due to suspicious circumstances surrounding her death that contradicted the initial medical findings. Dr. Francis Edward Camps confirmed that the actual cause of death was barbiturate poisoning. This was a significant finding that undermined Adams' account. Angus Somerville wasn't the only one who was suspicious. Some of Bobby's influential friends were also worried about her. They claimed they could see their good friend slowly becoming a drug addict, but they felt powerless. They had watched as their friend went downhill and became unsure about her doctor. They also contacted the police on the day Mrs. Hullet died. Angus Somerville and Bobby Hullet's friends had put some pressure on. The Chief Constable found himself under pressure, so for some reason decided to call an Eastbourne newspaper and gave a statement to a journalist regarding the inquest. It read, "An inquest was opened today on Mrs. Gertrude Joyce Hullet of Holywell Mount, who died yesterday. Only formal evidence of identification was given, and the inquest was then adjourned to await the results of a post-mortem examination." The press were left puzzled by this and tried to get more information, but the Chief Constable wouldn't give any more. Fortunately, as the journalists hung around outside the station, a policeman leaving recognised some of them as press and just happened to ask them if they were there because of the Hullet case, and mentioned it was about time someone caught up with that bloody doctor. The press trawled the bars and casks looking for some gossip, and there was plenty of it. The press coverage of the Adams case was nothing short of sensational. Newspapers splashed the headlines like "Murder Trial of the Century" and "Inquiry into 400 Wills," fueling public fascination and suspicion. Hannam from Scotland Yard was assigned to the case. He was a member of the murder squad at the Metropolitan Police. By the time of Adams' case, he had already gained national recognition for solving tough, high-profile murders, like the Teddington Towpath murder and the Neville Heath murders. He was known for being thorough, careful, and willing to pursue a case wherever the evidence or suspicion pointed, even if it upset local authorities. Hannam had a reputation for building cases brick by brick, and he was quite comfortable pursuing suspects who were socially prominent. Adams was well connected in Eastbourne society, but that didn't deter Hannam from suspecting him of multiple murders, and rightly so. The inquest into Mrs. Hullet's death was on the 21st of August 1956 and was conducted by Angus Somerville at the Town Hall. First up was Mrs. Hullet's daughter, Patricia, who said that her mother had possibly said something about taking her own life, but if she had, it hadn't been made clear. She said regarding a second opinion that she didn't think at the time they needed a second opinion on what had happened to her mother. Dr. Vincent Harris, a partner of Dr. Adams, said that Dr. Adams had never mentioned anything about barbiturate poisoning, and he knew nothing about Mrs. Hullet being depressed. He had been told she was just nervy. Dr. Harris had recommended she be moved to a nursing home or hospital, but Dr. Adams was against it because he claimed Mrs. Hullet had an immense hatred of such places. Dr. Alfred Shearer stated that when he had visited the lady to take a spinal fluid sample, she was in a coma. He had suggested that they should have the stomach contents examined immediately, as it looks like narcotics poisoning. And both Dr. Adams and Dr. Harris were against this, and both strongly agreed to cerebral hemorrhage, and he left it with them. The Home Office pathologist, Dr. Francis Camps, confirmed Mrs. Hullet had ingested a fatal dose of barbiturates, and 115 grains of barbiturates were found in her body. He thought it a matter for comment that Dr. Adams had not suspected barbiturate poisoning straight away. The staff at Holywell Mount gave their account of events, as did her good friends. When Adams gave testimony. Dr. John Bodkin Adams on Meghamide. Yes, he had given her barbiturates. Yes, he knew she wanted to die. When he found her unconscious, he didn't think she had overdosed. When he did finally think it was an overdose, he got the Meghamide. He gave her the dose he thought was the right dose. When it didn't work, he stopped. This contradicted the instructions that were not only with the medication, but were also told to him by the house doctor. For some reason, he wasn't questioned on that, only asking him if he had read the instructions, to which he had replied, no. The coroner did ask Adams why there had been no intravenous drip, to which Adams had answered she wasn't perspiring. She had lost no fluids. A nurse, however, described Mrs. Hullet as sweating a good deal from the 20th until her death. He also wasn't questioned on why he had tried to cash a £1,000 cheque quickly 2 days before Mrs. Hullet passed. He went on to claim that the doses he gave her were within normal limits and insisted that if she took more, it must have been by her own hand. Detective Superintendent Hannam was up, but the coroner knew he'd only just started to investigate the case and wondered if he wanted to adjourn the case. Hannam said no, he had no application to make. The coroner's advice to the jury. He offered the jury 4 possible verdicts: accidental overdose, the taking of her own life, the taking of her own life while of disturbed mind, or an open verdict. He also provided guidance on how to interpret the evidence. He steered towards the taking of her own life, noting that Mrs. Hullet had already been depressed and had expressed these thoughts before. While not directing the jury to consider criminal negligence, the coroner publicly questioned Dr. Adams' judgment. He stated it was extraordinary that the doctor, knowing the past history of the patient, would not at once suspect barbiturate poisoning. The coroner also highlighted Dr. Adams' poor response to giving the antidote to the patient. The jury concluded that Mrs. Hullet had took her own life while mentally disturbed. But that did not end suspicions or gossip. In fact, it had been the actor Leslie Henson who knew that both Mr. and Mrs. Hullet had been patients of Adams, who had telephoned Eastborne Police anonymously to warn them of the fears he and his wife shared, which became just one of the reasons for the subsequent investigation. Henson was in Dublin at the time of his friend's death and later claimed that Mrs. Hullet had been turning into a drug addict. He claimed the pills Adams prescribed had changed her personality and that he strongly believed they had ultimately caused her death. With the possibility of foul play still floating around Eastbourne, the newspapers hung around. Hannam was still there, and where he was, so was the story. Detective Superintendent Hannam, joined by Detective Sergeant Charlie Hewitt, also from Scotland Yard, and D.I. Brinley Pugh from Eastbourne Constabulary, viewed the circumstances as suspicious. The inquest's findings were one of the triggers for Scotland Yard to widen its investigation into Adams' prescribing habits, financial dealings and patient deaths. The Hullet inquest drew formal attention beyond Eastbourne. Hannam expanded his focus. The investigation was focused on the years between 1946 to 1956. He and his team examined Adams's dangerous drugs records, prescription habits, financial connections to patients, cremation cases, and importantly, wills. On the 24th of November 1956, he executed a search under the Dangerous Drugs Act, at Adams's home, and over the winter assembled witness statements from nurses, of which they found were split results. Pharmacists and friends of the deceased also split results. One nurse claimed that the doctor was very dismissive of nurses' concerns. There was plenty of praise for Adams, but a pattern of behaviour began to show. He was a charmer to the ladies, but if it was ignored, his attitude would change. His temper was said to be terrible, and witnessed by a few nurses. Other local doctors called him an inept bungler and a disgrace to the profession. One doctor did tell the police of a patient he'd been asked to look at after her family became worried that she was being drugged by Dr. Adams. When he saw her, she was in a drugged state and didn't even know her name. Adams gave her an injection in front of him. The doctor asked him why he'd done that. His reply was that she might become violent. They dismissed Dr. Adams as her doctor, and the new doctor started to treat her. Within 8 weeks she was back to good health and out shopping for herself. This was not the only example of this. There turned out to be quite a few more. Some of the patients themselves had dismissed him as their doctor after they didn't agree with his medical diagnosis and treatment they'd received. The detectives also compiled a file of patient legacies left to Adams by reviewing probate records, and they were concerned that the gifts were connected to end-of-life care. While the detectives investigated, they collaborated with Dr. Camps, who reviewed the death certificates issued by Dr. Adams during the 10-year period, including Edith Alice Morrell. He also helped expose what he believed to be a pattern of misconduct by Dr. Adams. He was also involved in the exhumation of some of Adams's other deceased patients, such as Clara Neal Miller, to gather additional forensic evidence. So from 1946 to 1956, Adams had issued 310 death certificates, of which 163 were thought to be suspicious, and 132 people left him money and other valuables in their wills. Through the said years, Dr. John Bodkin Adams made approximately £100,000 a year in modern currency every single year from legacies left to him in patient wills. Reviewing both Mr. and Mrs. Hullet's death, Dr. Camps had a theory that Adams' treatment of both Mr. and Mrs. Hullet could have hastened their deaths. On Mr. Hullet's death, when looking at the records, he stated in his opinion Dr. Adams's treatment on the night of Mr. Hullet's death was unusual and should have been treated much differently. He stated that it was supposed to be a heart attack but wasn't treated as such, and the patient didn't receive appropriate treatment. Dr. Adams had given Mr. Hullet a large dose of morphia, but Dr. Camps could see no reason for this, apart from the fact that Adams also benefited from Mr. Hullet's will. Going by the last inquest records, he believed Mrs. Hullet's death was not simply by taking her own life from a single impulsive overdose. Instead, he believed the drug levels and treatment delay could indicate culpable over-medication. Hannam was now at a stage in the investigation where he felt he was close, so he went for a pint in the local New Inn pub across the station, where he was joined by a group of journalists. Percy Hoskins was the chief crime reporter for the Daily Express, and the Adams case was not a run-of-the-mill story. It involved a respected doctor and a wealthy member of society in a quiet upscale town. This combination of elements, along with police speculation about hundreds of potential victims, made it a sensational, high-profile story that required a senior and experienced crime reporter. The press coverage at the time of the Adams case was intense, and while other outlets ran with the narrative of Adams as a mass murderer, Hoskins took a more sceptical and cautious approach, choosing to stick with the innocent until proven guilty approach. And it was no secret Hoskins and Hannam disliked each other, having clashed numerous times. Hoskins was convinced that Adams was a naive doctor who was being prosecuted by an overzealous and prejudiced detective, and he came to believe the doctor didn't understand just how much trouble he was really in. On Dr. Adams he wrote he'd never seen a man so neatly trussed up and ready for the scaffold as Dr. John Bodkin Adams. Hoskins would later imply that Hannam's relentless pursuit of evidence amounted to a witch hunt against Adams. He suggested that the police were biased against the doctor, who was simply easing the passing of elderly patients. And many believed that it was the animosity they had towards each other that Hoskins went towards the not guilty vote in the Daily Express, while many believed Hannam viewed Hoskins as an unprofessional adversary who was more interested in a sensational story than the truth. Adams had explained to Hoskins that having so many people supporting him gave him confidence that he would be okay, despite losing his mother and cousin. He knew his friends would help. He remained close with his elite friends and loyal patients. Hoskins continued to build up Adams while Hannam became more and more concerned the more they discovered about Dr. John Bodkin Adams. In December 1956, Mrs. Clara Elizabeth Bradham's body was exhumed under a Home Office order so that the forensic pathologist, Dr. Francis Camps, assisted by Dr. Keith Simpson, could conduct a post-mortem. It was very unusual at the time, and it showed how seriously Scotland Yard was treating Adams. Unfortunately for Hannam, the exhumation produced no conclusive evidence of poisoning or murder. Because Mrs. Bradham had been dead for 4 years, drug traces, especially barbiturates and opiates, would have degraded. Dr. Camps could not prove that her death was unnatural, and so the Crown dropped her case from the prosecution list. This was a bold move, very unusual at the time, and it showed just how seriously Scotland Yard was treating Adams. Another elderly woman was secretly taken out of Eastborne by her family to protect her from Dr. Adams' treatment. They were so worried about her when they saw her almost comatose in bed. A nurse helped by withholding the medication he had ordered for her. Then a private ambulance arrived to take her to London. Within a couple of months she was healthy again and fit enough to enjoy her granddaughter's wedding. The list kept growing. These cases were unpleasant, strange, disturbing and heartbreaking, but in the end they all came down to suspicious circumstances, without clear proof of a serious crime. By late 1956, Hannam had a vast collection of reports that he had compiled into a full report that would go to his superiors. The report focused on a pattern of suspicious deaths and financial gain by Dr. Adams. The chief superintendent was initially dismissive of the report, considering it speculative and based on rumours. So after the Director of Public Prosecutions requested more evidence, Hannam conducted further interviews. A more comprehensive 187-page document was later compiled, which proved instrumental in gaining the cooperation of the British Medical Association in November 1956, which had been an obstacle to the detectives during the investigation. It included all the statements made by Dr. Adams, like this one. When the doctor returned from Scotland after his shooting holiday with his good friend Sir Rowland Gwynn around the beginning of October, he happened to bump into Hannam one day. They passed pleasantries, and the doctor began telling Hannam about his life. Hannam got the full story from when his father passed to when he eventually arrived in Eastborne. He denied all the rumours, claiming they were all untrue. He explained that he believed it was God's plan, and if people didn't believe him, then there was nothing he could do about it. He said he believed it was God's plan to teach him a new lesson, and continued with his story about the passing of his mother and cousin, expressing how sweet the two women in his life were. He then spoke directly about the rumours. Looking at Hannam, he said, "You are finding these rumours to be untrue, aren't you?" To which Hannam replied, I am sorry to say it's not my experience, Doctor. Adams went on to claim, "It is strange. I give all my work. I gave a vow to God to help my poor national patients." Side note, he didn't mention the private ones. He went through his God-given duties through his day, including the time he spends with his private patients, and mentioned Gwyn popping into his home surgery in the mornings. According to Adams, he worked through the evenings and worked harder than all the other doctors he knew. The doctor then became curious about what Hannam had been told about him. Hannam said he had found out that Dr. Adams had forged prescriptions for some of his NHS patients using the name of another doctor. "That was very wrong," he replied. "I've had God's forgiveness for it. All of them were only to help the poor national patients. I love helping these national patients, for I gave a vow to God that I would. The health people can afford it. You haven't found anything else?" Hannam responded that he had been concerned about some of the legacies he had been left in wills. Dr. Adams replied that most of them were instead of fees. The talk would eventually turn to Mrs. Morell, where he claimed she insisted he have the items as gifts when she died because she knew he liked them. He claimed he didn't want them, but she insisted. In regards to Mr. Hullet, he said he was a good friend and he knew he was leaving him some money in his will. He claimed that Mr. Hullet was a generous man, so thought the legacies might have been a bit more. Mr. Hullet had already told him about the will, so it wasn't a secret that he was leaving him something. He rounded it off with, "Every one of these dear patients I've done my best for. I've only one thing in life, and God knows I vowed to him I would, and that is to relieve pain and try to let these dear people live as long as possible." Hannam was quick to respond, "What about the cremation papers, where he had lied when filling in the forms?" Adams said, "Oh, that wasn't done wickedly. We always want the cremations to go off smoothly for the dear relatives. If I said I was getting any money in the will, they might get suspicious, and I like cremations and burials to go smoothly. There was nothing suspicious, really. It wasn't deceitful." A pious statement served to deflect his deception, in my opinion. It also included the Dr. Adams remark, "Easing the passing of a dying person isn't all that wicked." The vast collection of reports also included all the findings regarding the drugs, treatment and causes of death from the Home Office pathologist. However, the strategy was to pick one or two of the 23 cases as tests. Although Hannam preferred the Hullet case, which was more recent, stronger, well documented, and the suspicious prescriptions were clear, the Attorney General, Sir Reginald Manningham Buller, reviewed all of Hannam's files and chose the older Edith Alice Morrell case for the first indictment, and decided that the Hullet case would be kept as a backup. He judged that the Morell's case, nursing testimony and prescription evidence, was the most trial-ready and jury-friendly. So the Morell case was chosen as the flagship prosecution. Hannam's legacy mapping, which covered 132 wills benefiting Adams between 1946 and 1956, supported the prosecution's idea of a system or pattern. However, the trial judge, Judge Devlin, later criticised the Yard for relying too much on suspicion based only on legacies. Edith Alice Morrell. Edith Alice Morrell was one of the wealthiest women in Eastborne, and of course a patient under the care of Dr. John Bodkin Adams. She was a dominant figure in her community and managed her large home, Marden Ash, with servants, parlourmaids, gardeners, a chauffeur and cook. She had her welfare looked after by a number of professional men like her bank manager, solicitor and doctor. By all accounts, she wasn't the easiest of women to work for. People used a few choice words to describe Mrs. Morell, and to put it politely, she could be difficult and rude, but sometimes also very charming and sweet. Her greatest loves in her life were her 2 children, her son Claude and her daughter Doris. She also took great enjoyment from her garden and home, and had a good group of friends around her. During the war, she took herself to a large Victorian hotel in Wales called the Pump House Hotel. She had a reputation for changing her will, and at one point while away in Wales she sent a letter to her solicitor Herbert James apologising for her propensity for changing her will, and she would like to leave her home, Marden Ash, and her cars to her daughter Doris. Her earlier wills had included money to be left to charities, but she had now changed her mind, as she believed she had already done so much for many charities in her lifetime. Later in 1940, she left the country completely and stayed in the Ritz Hotel, Montreal, Canada. She wrote about how beautiful the country was and how nice the people were. She went on to say that the country was doing all they could to help win the war. She said she was missing her home and was optimistic that the country would prevail through this time. In the spring of 1941, she had some devastating news. Her daughter had passed away after an operation. She had decided to change her will and thought she would like to leave her home to the Princess Alice Convalescent Home. She would later change her mind again, deciding to leave the home to her son Claude, hoping he survives to take it, as they were such terrible days. She made her wishes clear that when she died she wanted to be cremated and her ashes scattered at sea. She had a great fear of being buried or burnt alive, so she gave strict instructions that her executors should employ a doctor to ensure but by all means that her life was extinct. This would be a recurring theme in her wills. Mrs. Morell returned to Eastborne in July 1945, and in the very same month she had changed her will yet again, this time to include Dr. Adams, who was to receive £1,000, and her home, Marden Ash, was to be left to some charity for the poor or something similar. The will would be changed slightly again about a month later, and Dr. Adams would still benefit by £1,000. Sometime in July 1946, she had fallen at some point and hurt her knee. Dr. Adams advised she go and see a specialist in Harley Street, which she did. While there she came down with a terrible stomach bug. She wrote to her solicitor Herbert James, who I should say was also Dr. Adams' solicitor. She asked if she could take Dr. Adams out of her will without changing the whole thing. If she couldn't, she'd just have to leave it. Apparently she was angry with Adams, as she had been laid up for most of the summer with this illness, and she had blamed him. It was in 1949, while visiting her son in Cheshire, that she had a bad turn and suffered a stroke. Her son contacted Dr. Adams, who rushed to Cheshire and brought her home by ambulance train. She spent some weeks in a couple of nursing homes that she hated before being allowed home. Due to the stroke, Mrs. Morell was left paralysed down her left side. She had no use of her left arm and she struggled to walk. A number of nurses were employed, and she found a companion in May 1949 called Rosaline Spray to attend to her. Her companion, Miss Spray, told the detectives that even though her disability stopped her from doing some things, she still managed to stay positive. She went out for drives in the Rolls, sometimes just her and the chauffeur, and sometimes with her companion, Miss Spray, or Dr. Adams, who was now visiting daily, sometimes multiple times a day. Miss Spray did not like Adams. She found him brash and way too forward. The nurses were also suspicious of Dr. Adams. Nurse Agnes White was suspicious when Adams always asked to see his patient alone, but she already knew the doctor from another elderly woman she had looked after, and he was the same with her too. She didn't like his manner and claimed that if money was involved, Adams would be there. Not all the nurses disliked him. Some thought he was just being kind and thoughtful to his patient. In April 1949, after Mrs. Morell had been receiving the morphine and heroin for some months, Dr. Adams called Mr. Sogno, Mrs. Morell's new solicitor, himself, claiming Mrs. Morell was anxious and wanted to talk with him about her will, and he was to come and see her that very day. When he arrived, she told him she had decided that Dr. Adams was to receive the bulk of her estate. Mr. Sogno was shocked and strongly advised us to spend more time thinking about this before he took his leave. A year later, in March 1950, Dr. Adams turned up at Mr. Sogno's office and claimed that Mrs. Morell had told him she had meant to leave her Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost to him, but she had forgotten to put it in her will. He was adamant that Mrs. Morell was of right mind and was able to make a codicil to the will. He also claimed she had wanted him to have the jewellery that was kept in a locked box at the bank. Mr. Sogno strongly advised against this, and Dr. Adams grew agitated, saying that Mrs. Morell was anxious for the matter to be settled quickly. He insisted that Mrs. Morell wanted him to enjoy the car, so Mr. Sogno should prepare the codicil right away. The solicitor was appalled at the doctor's behaviour and told him he would not listen to him and would only take orders from Mrs. Morell herself. Mrs. Morell spent most of 1950 under the influence of medication, with Brown's the chemist sending a driver out with medications to Marden Ash around 4 times a week. The chauffeur, Thomas Price, was also sent to collect medicine for her on occasions. Nurses said the doctor gave her regular injections that he often got from his bag. The nurses also reported that the patient was receiving regular injections of morphia, and it was hinted that she had been given morphine because at times she was agitated and a trying patient. According to one staff member, she claimed she had become worried about her employer when she had taken some food to Mrs. Morell's room and the nurse refused to let her in. She demanded to be let in, and after a short scuffle, the woman got into the room and saw how bad her mistress looked in bed. When she inquired why she needed to be like that, the nurse told her she is so tense she needs to be kept quiet. To be clear, Mrs. Morell was in no pain, so there was no reason that she should be on such heavy drugs at all. The clue to the drugs given lay in Adams's diagnosis of cerebral irritation, which is not a formal diagnosis and can be associated with a number of conditions, and in the description given by the more senior nurse, Caroline Randall, who spoke of brainstorms, another non-medical term. Nurse Caroline Randall said, and to quote, "She was a very difficult patient and had brainstorms. I think there was no improvement in the cerebral irritation, and she would go into a temper very quickly and for no apparent cause. All the time on the doctor's instructions, I gave the injections of morphia, and the quantity was slowly increased and oftener." She continued, "She had different tablets to take to induce sleep, and sometimes phenobarbital in the daytime. I believe sometimes she had heroin. Quite often in the night she became ill and clammy, and from my experience I attributed it to the effects of the heroin." She concluded with, "Dr. Adams did not agree with me, and he thought the condition was not resultant from the drug." Sometime in September 1950, Adams went on holiday to Scotland. Mrs. Morell got very upset when she heard he wasn't around, and another doctor, Dr. Vincent Harris, was attending to administer her morphia that she was used to. She, it was claimed, was angry and demanded that she talk to her solicitor. Mr. Sogno arrived on the 15th of September, and she told him that she would write up a codicil and take Dr. Adams out of the will. She then called Adams, telling him he should come and see her straight away. He took a flight straight away and went to see her for the day on the 16th, and then returned to Scotland. Adams returned to Eastborne on the 24th, and it wasn't long after that Mrs. Morell started to go downhill quickly, but not before she'd torn up the codicil and kept Adams in the will, or so they thought. According to Sister Randall, about a month before Mrs. Morell died, she was always doped up with drugs, usually because she claimed the patient was restless. She added that Dr. Adams always visited at night and administered injections with drugs that he took from his bag. She was having morphine, heroin, pills and a strong sedative called formaldehyde, claimed the sister. She also admitted to it being excessive, especially as the patient wasn't in any pain. 2 weeks before she died, Brenda Hughes told how Dr. Adams had gone into Mrs. Morell's room alone and gave Mrs. Morell an injection. After she had told him, Mrs. Morell seemed pale and lethargic. She went on to say when he came out he told her what he'd done and that she should settle down now. He then said goodbye and went. Nurse Hughes claimed she'd been in the dining room at the time and the doctor had not obtained any drug for the injection from the dining room drawer. She went on to state that after 10 minutes she went into the room. She claimed she tried to rouse her patient but couldn't. She went to get the cook to sit with Mrs. Morell while she went to call the doctor. When she spoke with Dr. Adams, he told her they should expect these collapses as she is a very sick woman, but if the nurse was still worried, she could call him back. By the second week of November, Mrs. Morell was comatose for most of the time, mainly because of the drugs she was given. It was around now that she started with the jerky spasms. By the 12th of November, they had become aggressively worse. The night watchman, James Dean, told how, after Dr. Adams had visited Marden Ash at around 10 p.m. that night, he had found him looking at the Rolls Royce and commented to him that it was a beautiful car. It was at this point that the doctor had, according to Sister Randall, said that Mrs. Morell was not to come around because of the spasms, and he prepared a large dose of medication in a hypodermic syringe for her to give Mrs. Morell. She gave the injection to her while the doctor stayed in the dining room. Sister Randall claimed she didn't know what was in the syringe. She went on to say that the doctor filled another syringe with just as much quantity as the first before he left. She said that after the first injection, Mrs. Morell's jerky spasms became worse, and acting on the doctor's instructions, she gave her the second injection. Nurse Randall tried to call the doctor before this, but she said she couldn't get in touch with him at his home. Both injections had been given between the hours of 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. According to the nurse, after the second injection, Mrs. Morell quietened, and within 30 to 45 minutes she had passed away. The next day Dr. Adams arrived at Marden Ash at 11 a.m. Nurse Hughes said he went into Mrs. Morell's room and confirmed death by cutting her right radial artery, which was something Mrs. Morell had been particular about in her will. On the death certificate, he wrote her cause of death down as cerebral thrombosis, adding that she had been in a coma for 2 hours before her death. But the nurses had claimed she had been in a coma for at least 3 days. No post-mortem was carried out at the time, which was common in the 1940s for elderly patients under a doctor's care. Dr. Adams filled in the forms to have Mrs. Morell cremated. He filled in the part of the form that asks, "Have you, as far as you are aware, any pecuniary interests in the death of the deceased?" It would seem he failed to mention that he might well have, but put no. Following her wishes, she was cremated and her ashes were scattered in the English Channel. At the reading of her will, her son inherited most of her estate, while her gardener and chauffeur had been left a really decent amount of money. When it came to Adams, it would seem the codicil had been torn up, but that didn't make it invalid by law. So by law he wasn't entitled to anything. But Mrs. Adams' son kindly decided to ignore it and gave him a chest full of silver. He also hadn't been left a Rolls Royce, but Claude Morell decided he could have it, and a valuable antique cupboard. Dr. Adams thanked the family by handing them his medical expenses of £1,750. The main problem the police faced was that Adams was a doctor and the women were elderly. It sounds unfortunate, but it made a difference, especially in those days. Because he was a doctor, his actions went unquestioned. And since the women were older and had health problems, people rarely questioned what happened, putting their deaths down to age-related problems. Hannum knew early on that because of the profession of the man he was investigating, he may not be able to get the proof he needed, but he was damn well going to try. Through the summer months of August and September 1956, the police interviewed many people in Eastborne, the doctor's patients and the patient's friends, relatives and nurses spoke with them, and most of what they had to say wasn't very favourable to Adams. And it wasn't just patients. Lawyers spoke out, as did a few other doctors who defied the BMA ban. The British Medical Association had, just days after Scotland Yard took over the investigation, sent a letter to every doctor in Eastbourne. The letter served as a reminder of their ethical obligation to uphold patient confidentiality. The BMA's stance made it significantly more difficult for the detectives to collect evidence. They wouldn't lift the ban until November 1956, when the reports went in and the BMA cooperated. This investigation was fraught with difficult obstacles from the very start, and the investigation was just gathering circumstantial evidence. The detectives were everywhere in Eastbourne, and Dr. Adams carried on his practice as if nothing was happening. He had loyal patients and some loyal friends who stood by him, especially Sir Rowland Gwynn, who called Hannum and told him he didn't like all the rumours about his good friend Dr. Adams, who he claimed was one of the finest doctors in town and a great friend of his, and asked Hannum to do something to stop the gossip. Rumours were already rampant about Gwynn himself in Eastbourne. Sir Rowland Gwynn, the well-dressed and sharp chairman of magistrates in Eastbourne, would have no choice but to step down if his friend was arrested and put on trial. Why should the police stop the rumours? It wasn't their job to calm the fire that was already burning. The rumours were there well before the police even arrived. Hannum would not have taken kindly to this. The absolute dismissive manner of Dr. Adams and his friend might have surprised Hoskins, who thought it was naivety on the doctor's side. But was it? Hannum pondered on the reports he had read from the doctors. Home Office pathologist Dr. Francis Camps could not understand why such large amounts of hypnotic and narcotic drugs had been administered. Camps noted that Mrs. Morell had been given these drugs in quantities that made little sense, unless she had some life-threatening painful disease or cancer, which she did not. He observed that such increasing quantities would almost certainly lead to addiction, and that a death certificate in these circumstances would resemble clinical narcotic poisoning. In Clara Neal Miller's case, questions also arose around her treatment. The official prescriptions listed in her name at the Eastbourne chemist were not consistent with the injections she had actually been given 3 times a day. Substances that were never identified. These, it was reasoned, must have come directly from Dr. Adams's bag, rather than from any pharmacy records. Her death certificate stated cerebral thrombosis, but the evidence suggested that this explanation did not match her treatment history, raising concerns that her body might need to be exhumed. Taken together, the evidence also suggested that Jack Hullet's treatment had been mismanaged. Even though he had cancer, his death had been certified as cerebral hemorrhage. Yes, something seemed extremely odd to those reviewing the case. Surely, thought Hannam, the Chief Superintendent of Scotland Yard would see that there is substance in many of the Eastborne rumours. Hannam had included reports of patients going as far back as the 30s. Of course they were too old to investigate, but they showed a pattern of how Dr. Adams worked, and he wanted to show just how long Dr. Adams had been doing this. Another senior officer stated rumours that the doctor had put some of his patients out of the way in order to inherit legacies have been unsubstantiated, but he acknowledged that Dr. Adams' behaviour, both private and professional, was very shocking, and there was scope for further investigation if the Director of Public Prosecutions recommended it. What Hannam had held back from the report to his superiors, he didn't back at the Beachy Head Hotel. Hannam took a seat, lit his cigar and spoke with the journalists. He took a puff on his cigar and said, "I am quite confident Dr. Adams is a mass murderer. He has certainly killed 14 people, and if we had arrived on the scene years ago, I think I could have said he killed more." Hannam now decided it was time to use his controversial tactic of trying to crack someone he believed was involved alongside Dr. Adams in the death of Mrs. Neil Mills, landlady Annie Sharp. But before Hannam and Hewitt could interview her, they were called away to London for a meeting. While they were away, 76-year-old Annie Sharp passed away suddenly and cremated within the week. It was said she had cancer, and Dr. Adams was her doctor. Hannam decided to push forward and arrest Adams for the minor charges of false claims on the cremation papers. On November the 24th, 1956, the detectives arrived at Kent Lodge. Adams was about to leave for dinner when Hannam arrested him. He was charged with forging prescriptions and submitting false claims on cremation documents. They then searched his property under the Dangerous Drugs Act. They wanted to know where he kept the morphine and heroin. He replied he didn't have those sort of drugs at his place, as he hardly ever used them. Hannam recalled asking to see his dangerous drugs register. Adams claimed he didn't have one. He should have had one. Hannam showed him the list of medications on Mrs. Morrell's prescriptions. Dr. Adams said they were all delivered to the house and that she had nurses day and night. Hannam, who gave them to her? Adams, I did, most of them. The nurses some. Hannam asked if there were any left after she had passed. No, Adams replied. She had taken them all. Hannam, Doctor, you prescribed for her, the day before she died, 4,870 milligram of heroin. Dr. Adams replied calmly, Poor soul, she was in terrible agony. It was all used. I used them all myself. Hannam looked at Adams and said, Surely the amount of dangerous drugs you prescribed for Mrs. Morell in the final week of her life would be fatal. Is this usual for a cerebral vascular accident? Adam looked at the list again and said, There might be a couple of the tablets left. If there were, I would have destroyed them. I'm not dishonest with drugs. Mrs. Morell had all the drugs. I gave her the injections. Do you think it is too much? Hannam told him it wasn't his place to answer that. And when Hannam asked to see the prescription records, Dr. Adams replied he didn't keep one. The detectives began to search the room while Hannam questioned Adams some more. They spoke of other patients Hannam believed were suspicious and believed Adams had a hand in their deaths. While the room was being searched, Adams got up and started to look in a locked cupboard he had opened. He then pulled out a bottle with about 12 packets inside, and 7 empty bottles. Another had 22 tablets inside. All these had the name Mrs. Hullet on them. The detectives then noticed Dr. Adams moved to a cabinet and then took a small key out of his pocket that was attached to a chain. He opened a small compartment inside and put some bottles in his pocket. Hannam quickly moved in front of him. "What did you put in your pocket?" he asked. "Nothing," said Adams. "I was just opening it for you." Hannam: "What was it, Doctor?" Dr. Adams took out 2 cartons, each containing a bottle of morphine. Hannam labelled them as evidence while telling Adams not to be stupid. Dr. Adams' solicitor Herbert James turned up and the search continued. Dangerous drugs were taken from the doctor's bag and attaché case and labelled. He was asked for any records on Mrs. Morell, but the doctor claimed he didn't have any. It became quite clear that Dr. Adams was a hoarder. The chest full of silverware sat unused, and in the basement there were boxes of random silverware and china that had never been used, and plenty of car parts, especially tyres. In the rooms they found a collection of wine. Another room was full of all forms of guns. There was a room full of camera equipment. After the search they left, and at the station he was charged with forgery and the cremation paper offences. When Dr. Adams and Herbert James returned to Kent Lodge, Mr. James began his own search for anything that would help his client. After a while he certainly did find something: a collection of notebooks. 2 days later, Adams showed up at the police station for an official photograph, and while there he asked Hannam why they had said there may be further charges. Could he tell them what they are? Hannam told him he was still looking into the death of some of his patients and for hiding the morphine. The doctor asked which patients. Hannam answered, "Well, Mrs. Morell is certainly one." Adams said, "Easing the passing of a dying person isn't all that wicked," replied the doctor. "She wanted to die. That can't be murder. It is impossible to accuse a doctor." This, according to Hannam, was Dr. Bodkin Adams admitting he had accelerated Mrs. Morell's death. Hannam wrote out a report regarding the search of the surgery and the curious comments on behaviour of the prisoner, and he was convinced that if he had to be rearrested he would talk himself into a conviction. He was also puzzled as to why the doctor had lied about buying the drugs when it was easy to prove he had in fact bought large amounts. The amount of barbiturates he had acquired was extraordinary, and why had he prescribed morphia for the patient Jack Hullet the day after he had died? Was the doctor an addict himself? The drugs were delivered to his surgery, Kent Lodge. But no proof of this, just a thought. By now, Detective Superintendent Hubert Hannam and Detective Sergeant Hewitt were now not going to hold back, and moving forward, Detective Hannam made it clear that the deaths of many of the patients of Dr. Adams were considered suspicious, stating that Eastborne Dr. Escort is quite certain that Adams precipitated the death of some of his rich patients for his own pecuniary advantage, although he had to admit that Dr. Escort has no direct evidence of any actual case. When Attorney General Reginald Manningham Buller met with Detectives Hannam and Hewitt, Home Office pathologist Dr. Francis Camp and Harley Street consultant Arthur Duthwaite, along with the Director of Public Prosecutions Sir Theobald Matthews and Barrister Melford Stevenson at his office in the House of Commons, they had to decide what to do next. Buller looked at the 2 doctors and asked them about the heroin dosage Mrs. Morell had been given. They assured him that the amount of the heroin and morphia Mrs. Morell had been given was without doubt fatal. Hearing this, he ordered Hannam to go straight to Eastborne to arrest Adams for the murder of Mrs. Morell. Hannam and Hewitt were not exactly happy. They wanted a more recent case. Mrs. Morell had been gone 6 years, and they had no body. A continued investigation would give them a more recent case with proof and a body. They had been given some hope with the exhumations of Julia Broadening and Clara Neal Miller being granted. On the 19th of December 1956, Dr. Adams was arrested at his surgery in Kent Lodge. Dr. Adams had been seeing patients at the time and oddly had also been posing for photos and giving an interview with a reporter from a magazine. Hannam ordered them out of the house before the arrest went down. When the doctor was arrested for the murder of Mrs. Morell, his response was thought odd when he said, "Murder? Murder? Can you prove it was murder?" adding, "I didn't think you could prove murder. She was dying in any event." While the smog lingered in the air on the early morning of the 20th of December 1956, the 2 exhumations went ahead. Dr. Francis Camps was there to perform the post-mortems. The MDU asked Dr. Keith Simpson to observe. On Julia Broadening, he found no evidence of brain hemorrhage that Dr. Adams had diagnosed, but because of decomposition, he could not definitively establish her cause of death. Clara Neal Miller had been left naked next to an open window in winter when she died in 1954. Unfortunately, her grave had let water in and damaged her coffin. Dr. Camps did find some evidence consistent with coronary thrombosis and also pneumonia. Some small amounts of morphine was found and barbiturates, but nothing too damaging. And that was that. The medical profession seemed to be taking the whole Adams affair personally, even though many had spoken out against the shoddy work of the doctor and his behaviour, including showing how annoyed they were that he had dragged the good name of their profession through the mire. But there were also still those staunch believers of no professional doctor would commit any atrocity like murder, that they were outraged that anyone would consider a doctor guilty of murder just because he gave powerful drugs to a dying elderly person. Meanwhile, Dr. Adams had been sitting in Brixton prison. The BMA had been making sure he was being well looked after and had sent a solicitor out to the prison to make sure he had everything he needed. Mr. Herbert James, Adams' close friend and solicitor, would stick with his friend throughout everything. He dealt with all the doctor's business affairs while he was in Brixton and gathered as much support as he could from those who knew the doctor personally. And letters of support were sent along with gifts of food. Dr. Harris, on the other hand, had decided not to. He told James he wouldn't be any help whatsoever. On the 14th of January 1957, Dr. John Bodkin Adams appeared before Eastborne Magistrates' Court. Dr. Adams' friend, Sir Rowland Gwynn, had to step aside, as he should, for the preliminary hearing. It was cold outside with a promise of some snow inland, but it hadn't stopped the people and journalists gathering outside. It felt to some like the whole world was watching, and they were. Inside the courtroom, every seat was taken and the room was packed with little to no room left for standing. The prosecution barrister was Aubrey Melford Steed Stevenson, and he started off well with a statement that, in the case of Mrs. Edith Morell, the prosecution wished to present evidence of 2 further deaths at the hands of Dr. Adams, both of which are murder. Jack Hullet, like Mrs. Morell, had died after an injection of morphine. Jack Hullet, like Mrs. Morell, had added Dr. Adams to his will, and when Jack Hullet died, the doctor lied when signing the cremation form, just as he had done with Mrs. Morell. He claimed to have had no financial connection to the patient. Because of this, the body was burned and all evidence contained within went with it. After the death, Dr. Adams had written out a prescription for 5 grains of morphia in Jack's name and asked for the drugs to be sent to Kent Lodge. If he was replacing the amount of morphia he had given Jack Hullet just before he died, then we say that was a fatal dose and a dose meant to kill. The motive was money. Bobby Hullet, Jack Hullet's widowed wife, died in circumstances the Crown says amount to murder by Adams. Stevenson said whether she administered the fatal dose or not, from May 1st, 1956, the doctor had prescribed her quantities of barbitone. From that date, he embarked on a course of drugging her, which led to her death. He referred to the £1,000 cheque she had given him 2 days before she had allegedly overdosed, something the coroner seemed to miss at the inquest. Dr. Adams gave instructions to his bank that cheque was to be especially cleared. Stevenson said, "We say it was because he knew Mrs. Hullet was going to die that weekend." The Hullet cases and Morell case were relevant to each other because they were very similar in facts, he said. Frederick Geoffrey Lawrence was a defence lawyer for Dr. Adams. Preliminary hearings drew to an end after 9 days and closed with a 2-hour speech from Lawrence. Main points being, according to Lawrence, the gifts that Mrs. Morell had left Adams in her will were hardly worth murdering for, when she was worth far more to him alive, as she was a wealthy woman. Her medical fees she was paying was far more valuable to him. As for the Hullets' cases, he claimed they were too thin to even worry about. He said common sense was against the charge of murder. He made his points well and forcibly. Even though it was a long speech, apparently those that were there believed he was holding back, that he had so much more he wanted to say, but was saving it for if it went to trial. And sure enough, the jury decided Dr. Adams would stand trial at the Old Bailey for the murder of Edith Morell. After the preliminary trial, Dr. Harris, who had helped Dr. Adams at the inquest, called Hannam to tell him he had no idea what Adams had given Mrs. Morell or the amount. He said he had supported his senior partner in the Mrs. Hullet inquest as far as was honestly possible. But now that he looked back, he could see that if Dr. Adams did not intentionally mislead him in connection with Mrs. Gertrude Hullet, he most certainly kept back material facts which he should have known about. Dr. Harris had had no idea that barbiturates were being delivered to Holywell Mount, and that Dr. Adams did not ever suggest that she might have tendencies to take her own life. And if he had known about it, and that she had access to the excessive quantities of barbiturates, he would have most certainly insisted that she be removed to hospital. As for Mrs. Morell, he said he had given her prescriptions of Omnipon, a mixture of opium and alkaloids once, but couldn't remember why he had. Then we have Sir Rowland Gwynn, who also distanced himself from his dear friend, claiming he was just someone who came to his functions now and again and went shooting with him. He told people he was lucky to escape the friendship alive. When he spoke to Hannam on February 1st, 1957, he said Dr. Adams was a greedy man. He told him he had been his GP for 8 years, and since the doctor had been in custody, he felt much better. He said Adams had given him mild sleeping aids, but never injections. He then said under no circumstances would he see Dr. Adams again. Apparently, he had told friends he was lucky to have escaped the friendship alive, and had decided to opt for a sealed lead coffin instead of cremation, just in case murder was ever considered. On the 21st of February 1957, Buller told the judge he was not going to ask for the evidence for Jack and Bobby Hullet to be brought in, and wouldn't be arguing that the doctor had a system where he was killing others in the same way. Instead, he was going to bring the Hullet case in as a separate case if the doctor was acquitted of the Morell murder. If he was guilty, he may introduce the Hullet case. This had a lot to do with the change in the capital punishment laws at the time. A new Homicide Act was about to come into effect, making a single murder by poisoning a non-capital offence. However, a conviction on a double murder charge could still result in the death penalty. The prosecution's strategy was widely perceived as a move to make it more likely that Adams would be hanged if convicted. Geoffrey Lawrence was absolutely furious and shocked by what he heard. He believed that a fair trial was impossible. The trial began on the 8th of April 1957, as expected, with all the sensational headlines surrounding the case that stretched around the world. The courtroom was packed, with many more gathered outside. Dr. Adams stood in the box and pleaded not guilty when asked. In short, the prosecution began his opening speech and instructed the jury to only go by the evidence they will present. That Dr. Adams, by the administration of drugs to Mrs. Morell, drugs given by him and given upon his instructions, killed her. And our submission is that those drugs were given to her with the intention of killing her. He described Mrs. Morell, her wealth and her illness. He explained when the doses of morphine and heroin were first given, making it clear that both drugs were powerful, with heroin being the stronger. He also detailed the large amounts of both drugs that were administered to Mrs. Morell. He continued with letting them know of Dr. Adams's strange behaviour around her and how he produced her medications from his bag instead of using the prescribed medication that came to the house. Manning and Buller spent a great deal of time on what he called the murder time, emphasising the large and unnecessary amounts of strong drugs that were administered to Mrs. Morell, either by Adams or on his orders. There was no reason for the large dose, he said. An expert would tell them only someone in great pain would benefit from such quantities of these drugs, but Mrs. Morell was in no pain. He then turned to why. He suggested the motive being money and described Dr. Adams' visit to Mrs. Morell's solicitor, Mr. Sogno. He spoke of the last 2 injections given to the patient, 2 very large doses, one given by Adams and one given a couple of hours later by the nurse on the doctor's instructions. These injections, he said, on top of the heavy dose she had already had, killed her. He went on to add that Dr. Adams had said he had administered most of the injections himself throughout the patient's illness, and reminded the jury that doctors are not entitled to kill people, even if they wanted to die. He came to Dr. Adams' reaction when arrested. Murder, murder. Can you prove it was murder? I did not think you could prove murder. She was dying in any event. Does that sound like something an innocent man would say? He ended. The witnesses began with the chemists who dealt with the prescriptions, and with their answers it became clearer to the jury just how lethal the dosage given to the patient actually was. The 4 nurses who attended Mrs. Morell, nurses Randall, Stronach, Sister Mason Ellis, and Sister Brenda Bartlett, gave their testimony next. The older, more experienced nurses went first into the witness box. Nurse Stronach accidentally went first into the box. She told of following the doctor's instructions regarding the injections when on duty at the end of October 1950. She said that she gave hypodermic injections of 1/4 grain of morphia each night on Dr. Adams's instructions. Dr. Adams came himself each night at about 11 and gave a further injection, but she did not know what these injections were because it was Mrs. Morell's wish that the nurses should not be in the room at the time. Although they had seen the doctor prepare the syringe, they did not know what was in it. On day 2, the nurse continued. "Where did he get the injections from?" asked Stevenson. "From his bag." "How many injections did you see him give on each night? 1 or more than 1? "1. This, said Nurse Stronach, took place after she had given Mrs. Morell 1/4 grain of morphia injection at about 11 o'clock at night. When the doctor came on these visits late at night, was Mrs. Morell awake or asleep, or how was she?" "Well, she would be very dopey. She would be half asleep, because I had already given her an injection. She also said she couldn't say she saw any signs of her suffering pain. She went on to say that on her last day, the 2nd of November, Mrs. Morell was in an almost semi-conscious state and rambling. She also said she couldn't say she saw any signs of her suffering any sort of pain, but Mrs. Morell had said she was in pain at some point, but she took it as neurotic." Before Melford Stevens finished his questions, Judge Devlin asked where the medications was kept after they'd been delivered by the chemist to Marden Ash. The nurse replied, "In a drawer to the best of my knowledge." "Do you know if it was locked?" "I don't think so," she replied. Geoffrey Lawrence cross-examined. On Mrs. Morell he established that she was a very old lady of 81 and was paralysed on her left side. "She had great variations in her condition, did she not?" asked Lawrence. "She had. Sometimes up and sometimes down." "That applies to every patient." "Whether there were these ups and downs all the time? She was going downhill, was she not?" "Steadily. Generally deteriorating?" "Oh, yes." "And at the end she was, as you have said, very, very weak?" "Extremely weak." He then established that due to her condition she became irritable at times. The nurse said not just because of the injuries to the arteries of the brain, but she believed it was also due to the large amount of drugs she was on. Lawrence then returned to the 1/4 grain of morphia the nurse had given and questioned, "No other drugs?" She replied, "No." "No heroin?" "No." "No omnipon?" "No, not with me." And then Dr. Adams came and gave a further injection. "That is so. And that is what you still say?" asked Lawrence. "I do." Lawrence slowly went on to say that he remembered Sister Mason Ellis mentioning a book that they would write in to pass on to the next nurse at the inquest. "Is that right?" he asked the nurse. "That's correct," she replied. "We wrote down every injection we gave. We kept a report of every injection we gave, which is a usual thing when you are nursing, to keep a report of the injections you give." "It is a usual thing." "Yes, it is the proper thing to do." "Well, all experienced and trained nurses do it, do they not?" "Yes, they do." "And that is what you did?" "Yes, indeed we did." "So far as you know, all of you?" "Yes." "And whatever you wrote in that book would be accurate, would it not?" he said, looking straight at her. "Oh, yes," she replied. Geoffrey Lawrence then dropped the bombshell. He produced the books that had been found. Apparently they had been tucked away somewhere and only recently rediscovered. The prosecution was shocked that the nurses' record books still existed, and Lawrence had them. Lawrence would spend as long as he felt necessary on the records, going through the discrepancies in the nurses' statements according to the books. Some minor and not so minor. These notebooks would change this case drastically. Lawrence turned to the judge and told him, "These are the nurses' record books, and I am in possession of all nursing reports regarding this case. Nurse Randall confirmed it was the book when he showed it. She became distracted and reminded the barrister that it was a long time ago, so some details may differ slightly. He agreed and tried to keep her attention. He went on to tell the judge he had all the records, giving a day-by-day, hour-by-hour record of the activities of Dr. Adams that the Crown alleged are murderous. He asked Miss Stronach to look at the date June the 4th, 1950, the first time she went on duty at Marden Ash at 9 p.m. It was recorded that an injection had already been given to Mrs. Morell, an injection of a quarter grain of morphia with a third of a grain of heroin. Nurse Stronach, according to the book, had given Mrs. Morell a Sedamid sleeping tablet, some milk and brandy, and one special tablet, yellow. Thereafter Edith Morell had quite a good night. You did not give any injection, nor did the doctor visit. That is right, is it not? Questioned Lawrence. He continued with each night, and the medication was pretty much the same. There was no mention she gave any injection of morphia or that the doctor visited. It was, in fact, at this time, the day nurse who gave the injections. Geoffrey Lawrence obliterated Miss Stronach's witness statement, and she was left defeated. The Crown's cross-examination was weak and not much help. Judge Devlin asked the nurse where the drugs were kept in the house. She replied in a cupboard which was always locked. If the doctor needed drugs, he had to ask for the key to get them, but most of the time his drugs came from his own bag. Now the answers to the questions from the nurses were going to be awkward and difficult. Sister Mason Ellis gave vague answers. She couldn't remember. It was too long ago, if it was in the book. But she could confirm she had given injections of a mixture of morphia, heroin and omnipom that were recorded in the book. She also confirmed she had seen Dr. Adams give injections, but did not know what was in them or where he had got them from. She contradicted other nurses when asked where the drugs were kept in the house. She said they were on a tray in the dining room. Lawrence suggested the cerebral irritation was the reason for the sedation, not the result of the sedation, as had been claimed. The next day, Nurse Mason Ellis came under a savage attack from Lawrence when it was discovered she had been talking to the other two nurses, Nurse Randall and Stronach, on the train from Victoria to Eastborne, and they had been heard discussing the report in the newspapers. Needless to say, he was not happy. They had also been discussing the situation of where the drugs had been kept, and Mason Ellis told Lawrence what was said. She said, "There has been a little confusion about it. I think, sir, you see the drugs were kept in a drawer, not in a cupboard, and there was no key attached to them. On the night Mrs. Morell died, she had noted Mrs. Morell awake, not in a coma as the prosecution had stated." The prosecution cross-examined, "Was Mrs. Morell in any pain according to the records?" "No," she replied, "no pain at all." She confirmed it was unusual for a patient to be given the mixture of morphia and heroin on a routinely basis, day after day. No other doctor had asked her to do this. The next day, Nurse Randall took the stand. She was the nurse who was on duty the night Mrs. Morell died. Lawrence asked, "Do you think, nurse, that the doctor was just trying to give the patient a good night's sleep?" "Yes," she replied quietly. It now came down to the main contentions between the Crown and the defence. The Crown argued that drugging Mrs. Morell was unjustified and sinister because it was lethal and she wasn't in severe pain. They also claimed her brainstorms were a side effect of the drugs administered. The defence claimed the sedation was justified due to Mrs. Morell's restlessness, nervy outbursts and brainstorms. Lawrence relied on the wording in the book, especially on the night Mrs. Morell died, the terms used being jerky and shaky, becoming important. Lawrence to Nurse Randall. There is no mention, is there, from start to finish in your writing, of any twitching or jerkiness at all? No, sir, not here. This is the situation, is it not, that, although as a trained nurse on the night before you had used the word jerky twice, that is the only record throughout the whole of these books of the word jerky by you on that patient? Yes. You simply put very shaky and underline it. That is right, is it not? Yes, sir. Are you standing there in face of this record made on the last night by you? Are you standing there and saying, as a trained nurse with 25 or more years' experience, that when you wrote those words, very shaky, and underlined them on the last night report, they were intended to mean something quite different from what they had meant when you had used those very words in your earlier reports? Yes, I do. They were more intense. What was more intense? The shakiness or the jerkiness? Ah, but you just told me that the shakiness recorded in your earlier notes had nothing whatever to do with twitchings or jerkiness, didn't you? No, because they were quite different. What? Shakiness and jerkiness are quite different? Yes, sir. Well, that is what I thought. Then why, if you were recording something quite different on the last night, in the peace and quiet of what was then the room in which Mrs. Morell had died, if you were recording something quite different, why did you use the same words? I just don't know. I suppose I just wrote it down quickly. Lawrence continued to push about the difference in the wording, with Nurse Randall declaring that she could only remember just how very dreadful the jerks were. Nurse Randall said she never wanted to see anything like it again. It was very bad. Lawrence tried to establish that the patient wasn't in a coma. And as for the final injections, it was quite plain the doctor had given the nurse paraldehyde injection, not Nurse Randall, and the second large injection was not in the book. Nurse Randall was starting to get annoyed. She was sure she had given the injection and insisted it was paraldehyde. She knew this because Dr. Adams had told her so. She didn't understand why it wasn't listed in the book. Lawrence implied Nurse Randall was an unreliable witness, as she claimed she couldn't remember important points about the last night of Mrs. Morell's life. He left her shaken. The prosecution barely tried to restore Nurse Randall's credibility when asked about the smell of paraldehyde. The drug Dr. Adams said he had used, she said it had a distinctive odour, but the injection he had used did not have any smell. Sister Brenda Bartlett recalled Mrs. Morell being sort of semi-comatose, not in any pain, but pumped full of drugs. The following week for the prosecution, Solicitor Hubert Sogno, who represented Mrs. Edith Alice Morrell, recounted a conversation on the 5th of March 1950, where Dr. Adams told him that Mrs. Morell intended to leave him a Rolls-Royce motor car and the contents of a locked box kept at a bank. Adams suggested preparing a codicil that could later be destroyed if her son, Mr. Morell, disapproved. After that date, Mrs. Morell did indeed execute a will, leaving Adams an oak chest containing silver, and, if her son predeceased her, the Rolls-Royce. However, in September 1950, she amended her will with a codicil that completely excluded Adams. However, after her death, her son, Claude Morell, gifted the Rolls and the oak chest to Adams. Lawrence made the point of making the motive look weak by pointing out that Adams would have been left with nothing. Hannam testified about a meeting with Adams where the doctor reportedly said, "Easing the passing of a dying person is not all that wicked. She wanted to die. That cannot be murder. It is impossible to accuse a doctor." And later, when arrested, "Murder? Can you prove it was murder? I didn't think you could prove murder. She was dying in any event." Hannam described the search of Adams' home on the 24th of November 1956, conducted under a dangerous drugs warrant with Detective Inspector Pugh. During it, Adams allegedly claimed not to keep a dangerous drugs register since 1949, a legal requirement for tracking controlled substances. When asked who had administered the dangerous drugs he prescribed to Mrs. Morell, he replied, "I did nearly all. Perhaps the nurses gave some, but mostly me." Hannam continued, "During the search, Adams was also caught concealing 2 bottles of morphine by slipping them into his jacket before producing them when challenged." Hannam also added Adams had lied about his financial interests on the cremation papers. Hannam went on to tell them the conversation while searching the surgery. Adams was asked if any of the drugs were left over from the prescription of Mrs. Morell. Adams had said no, he had used them all. So there it was. The jury heard that Dr. Adams had said he had personally administered everything that was prescribed for Mrs. Morell. The full and fatal 78 3/4 grains of opiates. Of all the evidence against him, that which came out of Adams' own mouth was the most damning. Lawrence tried to discredit Hannam by claiming that Dr. Adams hadn't said anything about the Rolls-Royce to him at all, or that he didn't have any drugs left from Mrs. Morell's prescription. Lawrence was determined to discredit Hannam's character, claiming that in fact Dr. Adams had said he didn't remember if he had given all the medicine to Mrs. Morell. But there was no moving Hannam. He had stood his ground. He was used to this. He told Lawrence all he had told him was the truth. The prosecution leaned on the words, "Murder, murder, can you prove it was murder?" And Hannam claimed the doctor was indeed shaken when arrested. 2 key medical experts testified for the prosecution. Dr. Arthur Henry Duthwaite, who insisted that the drug dosages were unquestionably fatal and reflective of intent to kill. Dr. Michael Ashby, who was more reserved, he did not conclusively rule out a natural cause of death, which didn't help the prosecution as it built reasonable doubt. Expert witness for the defence was Dr. John B. Harmon, who testified and offered a counter view of medical interpretation, strengthening the doubt. The prosecution counter-asserted that Dr. Harmon had little experience in drug addiction, reminding the doctor that Mrs. Morell had been on regular injections of morphine and heroin for 2 years for a stroke. Dr. Harmon had to admit he had never used those 2 drugs for anyone who had had a stroke. When it came to the paraldehyde, Dr. Harmon stood firm and claimed that those last 2 injections had had no effect and did not cause death. He also had to admit that with the high respiration rate of Mrs. Morell when semi-comatose caused spasm, death could occur. Sir Frederick Geoffrey Lawrence's closing speech challenged the blanket assumption of malicious intent, asserting that trying to ease the last few hours of the dying is a doctor's duty, and it had been twisted and turned into an accusation for murder. He positioned the drug administration as compassionate care rather than a lethal act. He emphasised how much of the prosecution's case rested on unreliable recollections by nurses, recollections directly contradicted by their own contemporaneous records. The notebooks Lawrence produced contained detailed logs of injections and conditions, fundamentally altering the prosecution narrative. He also successfully discredited expert witnesses like Dr. Duthwaite, leveraging inconsistencies and shifts in their testimonies. He subtly undermined the prosecution's credibility by highlighting that the evidence was largely circumstantial and reliant on flawed memory, and drawing attention to documentation. Lawrence methodically dismantled the case built by the Crown. Manning and Buller got up and left a question hanging. Why did Dr. Adams put Mrs. Morell on a regime of morphia and heroin? Yes, she had received morphia in Cheshire, but not heroin. Even Dr. Harman, who was an unsatisfactory witness, could suggest no reason for the heroin. So why was Mrs. Morell made a drug addict by Dr. Adams? Could it have been that his intention was to make the elderly and rich lady, his patient, well disposed towards him, with a view to benefiting under her will? When it came to the nurse's report books, he claimed it was possible that Dr. Adams could have arranged things so the report book would not make things look so bad for him. The nurses had never been in the room with him when he gave the injections. He was alone and they were always in his bag. Take into account the discrepancies in the prescriptions and the doses the nurses gave. The doctor claimed they were all used, so where were the rest? He suggested the jury give great weight to Dr. Duthwaite's claim that the last 2 weeks of Mrs. Morell's life was leading to an intention to kill. Unlike Dr. Harman, Dr. Duthwaite was a great authority on morphine and heroin. In my submission on the evidence, it is proved beyond reasonable doubt that the cause of Mrs. Morell's death was the administration of those drugs. In one of the most significant legal developments from the trial, Judge Devlin instructed the jury on what became known as the double effect principle. A doctor may lawfully administer treatment aimed at relieving pain or distress, even if it inadvertently shortens a patient's life, provided recovery is no longer possible. Devlin guided the jury to consider whether the jury should accept Dr. Adams' admission that he had administered the full dosage he'd prescribed, in the context of the patient's agony and as part of the broader statement, rather than isolating it as proof of intent to kill. Discrepancies between the amounts prescribed and those recorded by the nurses. He reminded them of the lack of secure storage for the drugs and noted that some nurses had lied under oath about how they were kept. Devlin characterised the defence case as manifestly strong, contrasting it with the prosecution's weak premise, especially regarding motive and presentation. He directed the jury to only convict if they could reject all of the defence's arguments. Following his directions, the jury returned a not guilty verdict after just 44 to 46 minutes of deliberation. Dr. John Bodkin Adams was acquitted of the murder of Mrs. Morell. Now they needed to consider what they were going to do about the Hullet case. Judge Devlin inquired about the second indictment. The Attorney General, Reginald Manning and Buller, entered a nolle prosequi, halting the case without a verdict, something only an Attorney General could use and not really meant for a court of law. Judge Devlin was against this and wrote that he felt it was an abuse of process, leaving Adams without the chance to clear his name. This meant Adams was never acquitted or convicted of Hullet's murder. The charge simply remained dormant. After Dr. Adams left the court, he gave his thanks through the press, in particular through Percy Hoskins of the Daily Express, who had claimed Adams' innocence throughout. Adams went on to claim he had thanked Geoffrey Lawrence personally. Lawrence later went on to say he never got any form of thanks from Dr. Adams at all. The decision was controversial. Some even suspected political and establishment influence, as Adams was well connected socially and professionally. The judge later recorded that Lord Chief Justice Rayner Goddard had called him to say that if Adams should be acquitted, he would be inclined to grant him bail in respect of the second trial. A shocked Judge Devlin had never heard of a murder suspect being granted bail. It was later suggested that Goddard's view may have been somewhat swayed or tainted, as he had been seen out dining with Adams's good friend Roland Gwynn, the Eastborne magistrate, in February, but Devlin did consider it. Devlin also considered at a later date that Dr. Adams had given Mrs. Morell an injection of something other than formaldehyde, as that has a distinct odour, and the nurse had said in court that there was no odour from the syringe when she washed it. Although the murder charges were dropped, Adams faced forgery and prescription offences under the Dangerous Drugs Act, also false statements offences relating to cremation forms. He was found guilty in July 1957, but these resulted only in fines, not prison. The fines amounted to £2,450 for 14 offences. Back at his home at Kent Lodge, Eastborne, Dr. Bodkin Adams carried himself with a sanctimonious air, insisting he had been vindicated as a devoted physician, yet this self-styled morale posture rang hollow, when soon after the General Medical Council struck him from the medical register for reckless prescribing and grave professional misconduct, a censure that revealed the chasm between his cultivated image and his troubling clinical practice. The society did not like all the unnecessary publicity he had attracted. Adams claimed he had tried to avoid the publicity, but forgot to mention the £10,000 he had been paid for a serialisation of his life to be published in the Daily Express. While his lawyer fought to get him reinstated every year with the Medical Council, Adams went about his hobbies of shooting and travelling. He was often seen in the company of the senior ladies. He drove around in his Rolls Royce, and eventually in 1961 his lawyer was successful and he was reinstated. He opened a private practice, but it was a much smaller practice. Due to the dangerous drug ban, he was not allowed to use those certain medications anymore. Superintendent Herbert Hannum privately believed the doctor had escaped conviction, not due to the innocence, but because the Crown's case had been mishandled. He was convinced Dr. Adams had possibly killed many patients. Likewise, Detective Sergeant Charles Hewitt, Hannum's right-hand man. He shared these reservations, and they were not alone in their thoughts. So many people, not just in the UK but in many parts of the world, agreed with them, while others saw him as a victim of sensationalist accusations and legal overreach. In July 1983, at the age of 84, he slipped while out shooting and broke his leg. Complications followed, and he died of a chest infection and heart failure on the 4th of July 1983 in Eastborne Hospital. He was cremated and his will read, leaving his large wealth to various individuals, including £1,000 to the journalist who stuck by him, Percy Hoskins. Hoskins gave the money away to charity. His remains found their final resting place back in his native Northern Ireland, where he was laid to rest in his parents' family grave at the Coleraine Cemetery. Acquitted but never absolved, Dr. John Bodkin Adams died with his secrets. To some he was a killer, to others an angel of mercy, but only he knew the truth, and he carried it with him to his grave in Coleraine. Thank you for watching or just listening.